So welcome, everybody, to the 2019 Ecology Exam review live stream. Happy to see you all here. So there's no real official format. I'm available to answer questions. Sometimes I'll give you some general comments. But as soon as we get going, feel free to start typing in some questions to the live chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. I will take a moment to introduce one of my important coworkers here. This is Pinky. He's one of my kitty cats. He's very sweet. Say hi, Pinky. Yeah, he doesn't really like strangers much, but he likes to sit on my lap during the live stream. We need a little more audio. Well, maybe I'll try to just sit a little bit closer. Okay, I'll try to speak a little louder. Let me know if you have audio issues, okay? So some questions are starting to come in. So I'll go ahead and start answering. And again, if you have specific questions, please let me know. Okay. So there was already a question about global warming versus climate change. So, in common usage, people will tend to use them interchangeably, but they really don't have the same meaning. Global warming is pretty specific. It's the actual temperature heating up on the planet, right? In technical terms, we say the average global temperature, whereas climate change is a reference to the very many effects of the warming temperature, many of which are not seeming to have a lot to do with temperature. And the term climate change has become more commonly used, and it's kind of more accurate if you're talking about all these other things and not just the warming temperature. So we say that the greenhouse effect, the enhanced greenhouse effect, is causing global warming, and global warming is causing climate change. Question about scientific argumentation. So that refers to when I presented to you guys about CERs, right? And CER is sort of the first part of scientific argumentation. It's where you say, this is my argument, right? Here's my evidence, here's my reasoning, this is why it supports my claim. And then the process actually goes on and on. People might criticize your argument, they might have a counter argument, right? You might have to debate it and come up with more evidence. And that whole process is is argumentation, scientific argumentation, okay? And it's really just the way science works. Or certainly how it should work. Lance is asking about climate change and California in particular. So in California, there's really a few issues we're most concerned about. Sea level rise, because we're a coastal state, so we have a lot of people that live on the coast and a lot of people that live around places like the San Francisco Bay. So the problem of sea level rise is going to be an expensive and difficult one. Also the problem of wildfires, which we've seen very much in the last couple of years, and that's expected to continue to get worse, unfortunately, at least some years, as a result of climate change. And then finally, of course, the effects on our water supply. Given that we depend on a snowpack that is going to become less predictable, probably less of it, may even disappear entirely. So we're going to have to find some good ways to get additional water instead of the snowpack that we've come to rely on. Oops. Okay, and sometimes I do fall a bit behind on the questions, so go ahead and, if it seems like I'm way behind, kind of pause for a bit. Hi, Ronit, good to see you. It's awesome to see some of my former students sometimes. Welcome. Let's see, Amog is asking about negative feedback loops. So for purposes of the test, you only need to show one, okay? We'll just kind of keep it simple. Otherwise, they get kind of long and ornery. So in general, most conditions can go higher or lower, but for purposes of you showing that you understand what a negative feedback loop is, you can just show one direction. That makes the most sense for your example. Lucas is asking about the natural and man-made water cycles relating to water scarcity. So I'm going to just the term natural and man-made water cycle is kind of not that helpful. The infrastructure that humans have built is integrated with the natural water cycle. Sometimes we use the term constructed to differentiate from natural, but in terms of water scarcity, that's not really caused by either one of those. It's caused by changes happening to our water supply and the fact that we continue to use more and more water. And we might have issues as far as what we've built, the infrastructure, the constructed water cycle, may not be sufficient to meet the challenges of having less water supply in the natural water cycle. Okay, so hopefully that addresses your question. Vignesh is asking about deforestation contributing to global warming. So yes, I sort of casually refer to that in class as the double whammy. So the idea there is that having a forest full of trees acts as a carbon sink. So what that means is that there's a lot of carbon stored in the forest and it's actively taking in carbon. So it's really helping us out tremendously in terms of absorbing some of the carbon that we are putting out through burning fossil fuels. So when we cut down a large amount of trees or burn them, which is often what happens with deforestation, we actually cause two problems. One is that, well, we cause many problems, but the two problems related to climate change is that the trees are usually burned, sometimes left to rot, but often burned so that the land can be used quickly. And if that happens, then a lot of carbon that was contained in those trees is going to go into the atmosphere through combustion and go into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And of course, that's a greenhouse gas. And then from then on, you don't have all those trees constantly taking in carbon dioxide in the process of photosynthesis. So you lose the benefit of having that absorption of carbon dioxide. So when we continue to cut down trees around the world, we're really decreasing the ability of nature to help us absorb all this carbon, and we're adding the carbon to the atmosphere faster. So just to tie that in, by leaving forests intact, that's one of the most powerful things we can do to mitigate climate change, because it helps us to continue to absorb that carbon dioxide that we're still putting out. Minjay is asking about renewable and sustainable. So renewable simply means you can get new, right? Renew. So for some types of resources, and water is an example of that, fresh water, okay, that supply is constantly renewed from our perspective, because as water goes through the water cycle, new fresh water is coming down in precipitation constantly, right? So for our purposes, that's renewable, as compared to something like oil, which is non-renewable. There's no new oil forming on Earth. So, you know, it's going to run out. I hope we'll stop burning it before it runs out, but it is going to run out. It is a non-renewable resource, okay? Now, that's a separate idea from whether or not something is sustainable, okay? So for something like water, for anything to be sustainable, actually, it means that you're using it at a rate that you will continue to have access to that resource for a long period of time, right? How long? Indefinitely. You know, sometimes, you know, the American Indians used to say for 7 generations, right? This conception of like making sure that those resources are there in the future because you're not destroying the basis of where they come from, and you're not using them at a rate that is going to use them up, okay, before you get more. So in a way, it's really hard to apply the concept of sustainability to something like oil, because whether you use it fast or slow, it's going to run out. So that doesn't really apply very well to non-renewable resources, but it applies very well to things like water, okay? And the idea there is that as long as we use our water at a rate that is not faster than we're getting new water, right, that we can use it sustainably, okay? And of course, the term sustainably has become a buzzword, right? It's used a lot. It kind of means just living efficiently, living green, okay? But efficiency is not the same as sustainability. We can try to be efficient with water and we could still be using it too much, okay? So you have to compare the rate at which we're using it to the rate at which we're getting it, regardless of how we're using it. Let's see. Yeah, thanks, Hayden, for answering Lance's question. And by the way, since this is our first live stream together, it's totally fine to answer each other's questions. I try to look ahead once in a while. Sometimes I'll start answering them and I'll find out you already answered them for each other, which is awesome. I'll at least read it and make sure that, you know, if I have anything to add. But I appreciate it. It's totally helpful when you help each other out. And it's also a good practice for you. So Shubham's asking about mitigation and adaptation. Okay, so remember that mitigation is a regular English word. Okay, it's nice academic vocabulary. Mitigation for a problem are things you do to reduce the severity, we would say, reduce how bad the problem might be in the future. Okay, so I could mitigate being tired at the end of the week by getting more sleep earlier in the week. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean you can prevent a problem. Okay, so when we're talking about a problem like climate change, we cannot prevent it, it's already underway, but we can mitigate it, make it less bad by reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases so that the problem will perhaps happen more slowly or to less of an extent than it would if we just keep burning lots and lots of fossil fuels. Okay, so in the context of climate change, mitigation is anything we do that reduces our emission of greenhouse gases or helps to reduce the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. So leaving a forest intact is actually mitigation, even though it's not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But most of the things referred to as mitigation have to do with reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So if I use energy efficient appliances, that's mitigation, right? If we conserve water, that's mitigation because it takes a lot of energy to provide our water. Okay, so if we drive less, that's mitigation. Anything that reduces the emission of greenhouse gases. Okay, adaptation, on the other hand, is how you adapt to the already changing conditions. Okay, so it's the end of the week, I'm already tired, right? Maybe I take a nap or something, or I drink some tea, right? It's too late, I'm already tired. So in the context of climate change, what that means is that the conditions in the world are already changing, and they're going to change more and more. And we're going to have to do things differently to adapt to that, to function in these different conditions, right? So we can sort of plan ahead and realize that we can start putting these adaptations in effect now, be prepared to do them as conditions become more challenging, so that we will be able to function better. Some examples of adaptation might be starting to restore wetlands in areas where we know that flooding might occur. Okay, so that's going to help us to adapt to the fact that sea level is increasing all the time and is certainly going to be higher in the future, and that will give us some protection. Okay, adaptation might be starting to plant different crops in places that we know are becoming hotter and drier, and planting crops that can do well with different conditions and help to feed more people. Okay, it could be deciding that we're going to start buying land on the coast and telling people that they need to move inland, right? Starting to move some of our infrastructure inland so that sea level rise won't destroy it. Okay, so those are all things that are adapting to those changes as they occur or after they've occurred. They aren't going to slow down climate change at all. They're not going to stop it. Okay, and they're not even going to slow it down at all. Okay, only mitigation will do that. And of course, the point is we've let the problem go enough that we need to do both. We need to do everything in our power to mitigate, right? So that the problem doesn't become so bad that we really aren't able to adapt in a way that's going to allow us to, have the kind of life that we would like to have. Kush is asking about scientific investigation again. So I already talked about the idea of argumentation. Investigation means how do we find stuff out? Okay, so you guys have all learned about the sort of scientific method and experimentation, and I wanted to make the point early in the year, and I've tried to continue to make it during this unit, that that's not the only thing. Okay, and I especially want to make that point when we study ecology, because there are lots of experiments done in ecology, but when you're talking about the climate of the whole Earth and what might happen in the future, we can't run an experiment on that, right? It's too big, it takes too long, and it's happening. So what we mostly use are models, right? And in this case, they're usually very complex computer simulations, right? There's different kinds of models, but in terms of climate science, a very common way to try to understand what's happening and what might happen in the future is to develop these very complex computer models that can run different scenarios, and you can change the variables, and see which ones seem to match what's already happening, and then that tells you you have a pretty good model, right? And as we learn more about how climate works, we add more things to the model, and that allows us to make predictions to say what we think things might be like in 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years, and what they might look like if humans did different things. What if we burned less fossil fuels? What if we burn the same amount of fossil fuels? What if we cut down this forest, right? So it helps to give us a sense of what might happen so we can prepare, but also what types of things might be most effective in terms of either mitigation or adaptation. Caitlin's asking, is infrared radiation a type of solar radiation? Yes. So solar radiation includes energy at different wavelengths. So it includes infrared radiation as well as things like visible light and UV radiation. Okay. Matthew's asking, do we need a new state for the positive feedback loops? No, you don't necessarily. I mean, if it sort of obviously fits in with your example, feel free to put it in there. But for example, if you're using a climate-related example, I don't know specifically what the new state's going to be, right? It could just continue to get worse and worse and worse until we aren't here anymore to know about it. I don't know. I hope not, right? But it's unless it fits in with your example and there's sort of a clear new state, right? Like death, it's fine to just leave that out and focus on making sure that your feedback loop is truly a loop, right? That each thing is leading to the next, and that it's sort of continuous in the sense of becoming more and more of whatever is happening. Joshua is asking about overexploitation. So the term to exploit something is to use it. In the context of CHIPO, which I assume is why you're asking, it can mean to use resources like mining or something like that, right? But in terms of CHIPO, it really just means using the animals, right? Or it could be the plants, right? It could be like taking all the trees actually could be considered overexploitation. A lot of times we mean that we've like killed all the animals for something, whether it was a part of the animal that we wanted or something like that. So sort of using it too much, right? Sometimes you'll also hear the term overharvesting. In this case of fish, we use the term overfishing. So those all refer to killing things in a way that is unsustainable. So I'm going to connect it back to that term, right? Because the idea is that, of course, plants and animals reproduce, right? But if we kill them faster than they can reproduce, then that's not sustainable, and that's going to be overexploitation, and it could cause that organism to go extinct. Okay, looks like I got behind, so give me a moment to catch up with some of the comments here. Okay, yeah, thanks, Rohan. That's another good explanation of exploitation. Okay, and I see Ria responding about carbon sinks. Okay, good. Yeah, that all looks good. I guess the only thing, yeah, I would just clarify on your answer, Ria, to Hayden about carbon sources. It could be any kind of combustion if the thing you're burning contains carbon, right? So, of course, the most important one is the burning of fossil fuels, but of course, the burning of trees as well. Respiration is, although the reality is, in terms of numbers, respiration is not making most of the carbon dioxide go out, unless you're talking about some huge new source, like if the permafrost should thaw and you have a lot more respiration happening in that soil. Although the main concern with permafrost thawing is the methane. So respiration, in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide, isn't really huge, to be honest. It's much more important than some of these other larger sources. Kush is asking, could trees be both mitigation and adaptation? Yes, they could be. Okay, obviously mitigation because of absorbing carbon dioxide. Adaptation in terms of like, you could plant a tree for some shade if it's hotter, right? I mean, there are ways that trees will help us. They could be a windbreak in a storm, right? So, because these natural systems, because nature provides so many benefits, a lot of natural things are mitigation and adaptation, right? Energy efficiency is mitigation and adaptation, okay? Because we might not have so much energy in the future. Same with water, right? So there are things that sort of do double duty, and obviously we should be trying to do those things. Um, so there was a question about soil being a carbon sink. There is a lot of carbon in soil, okay? So that's a clarification. I think that was an issue on the last checkup, okay? So there's a ton of carbon in soil, a lot, because you have, layers and layers of all this organic matter in the soil. So there's a lot of carbon in molecules in the soil. So in that sense, it's a sink, but it isn't actively absorbing carbon from the atmosphere, okay? If anything, it's the other direction. The decomposers are actively putting carbon into the atmosphere. So but we really worry about all that carbon in soil because if we allow soil to sort of wash away or be exposed to where it's the organic matter is being decomposed more, that can add a lot of carbon. And we can enhance the ability of carbon to be a carbon sink. There's ways we can put sort of carbon material in the soil that will sort of keep it away, keep it out of the atmosphere, keep it from undergoing decomposition and going into the atmosphere. So there are ways that we can make use of soil as a carbon sink, even though it's not actively absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Okay, Joshua was asking about ocean acidification. So I'm going to give you a really basic explanation. I at least did not teach it to a very high level this year, and so I don't want to confuse people. So my expectations are that you understand the basic thing that's going on, okay? Which is that if there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and there is also carbon dioxide dissolved in ocean water, okay, that's how that's how producers in the ocean get carbon dioxide, okay? Those molecules, depending on a bunch of factors like temperature and concentration, a bunch of other things, molecules randomly move all the time. So some molecules of carbon dioxide from the air are going to dissolve into the water. Some molecules of carbon dioxide from the water are going to move into the air. Now, because we're adding so much carbon dioxide into the air, what we're seeing is a faster rate of carbon dioxide diffusing into the ocean than out. Okay? And so what that means is there's essentially higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the ocean. Only in the ocean, what happens, it's a little more complicated than in the air where the carbon dioxide is just sort of floating around, right? In the ocean, the carbon dioxide immediately starts reacting with water. So you have some dissolved carbon dioxide, but a lot of the carbon dioxide starts to undergo these chemical reactions, okay? And carbon dioxide plus water makes carbonic acid, okay? You're going to need that later in this year as well, okay? So carbon dioxide plus water, carbonic acid, okay? So that starts to make the water more acidic. Now, through some other chemistry that I'm not going to get into right now, it also makes it so that organisms have a harder time making their shells because their shells are made out of calcium carbonate, and those chemical reactions affect each other, okay? So that the more acidic the water is, the harder it is for shelled organisms to make the reaction to form the calcium carbonate, and sometimes the calcium carbonate even dissolves, okay? So for shelled organisms, which are sometimes little tiny planktonic organisms at the base of the food chain, they're having a harder and harder time, okay? And that could have some major impacts on life in the ocean. And then, as a side note, you want to remember that the ocean is not only becoming more acidic, it's becoming warmer. And that's just a lot of changes for life in the ocean at a rate that's faster than many organisms are going to be able to adapt to it in an immediate sense or in an evolutionary sense. And so it's likely to drive a lot of organisms in the ocean extinct and to do things like destroy many coral reefs. Okay, so that's a problem of real concern. Leon is asking about genetic biodiversity. So that means different genes. And it could be talking about the entire planet, like all the genetic information that's in you and bacteria and a tree and a mushroom, right? It can also be used in a smaller sense. So, for example, there could be genetic diversity in humans, right? Because humans aren't all the same. We contain different genetic information than each other. So that's good, right? We want to not all be the same because sometimes those differences are very helpful, right? So, in that sense, genetic diversity can be within a species. It depends on the context that you're talking about. Okay, it looks like there's some questions going around about thermal expansion. Yeah, and the way to think about that is this idea even came up today, where heat makes molecules move more, and as they move more, they sort of move farther apart, right? So literally that water starts to increase in volume. Okay, Avanish, good description there about going from sort of the slow cycle of carbon, and you called it old reservoirs of carbon, like forests and fossil fuels, into current carbon cycle. We call that the fast cycle, or the short-term cycle. And the idea is it's cycling through the atmosphere, even if it's going in and out of living things. And so by pulling more carbon into that sort of fast cycle, it means at any given time, the atmosphere is likely to have a higher concentration of carbon, carbon dioxide, methane, etc. Okay, so I see a few questions about the greenhouse effect. So again, I'm going to do a fairly short, straightforward explanation. Okay, you've got some other resources to look at. Remember that in the climate and carbon change debrief PowerPoint, I put the video and the bigger version of the greenhouse effect diagrams. You might want to check that out in my locker. But the sort of short version would be to start with solar radiation, right? You've got solar radiation, remembering that that contains different wavelengths of energy. It could be things like UV light, infrared, visible light. They're all coming in from the sun. Some of it is reflected off different parts of the atmosphere, but plenty of it's coming into Earth. Okay, hits the Earth, water, ice, rock, whatever it hits. That energy is absorbed into those materials, depending on what the materials are. Okay, and that warms up, makes the molecules move a little bit more. And when the warmer things are, the more infrared radiation they emit, okay? Because they sort of get excited, right? And some of that energy is going to be emitted out, okay? Some of it even goes out as heat. But if the infrared radiation goes out, then it happens to be the right wavelength that when it hits a greenhouse gas molecule, it excites that molecule, right? And some of the energy is transferred to that molecule. And depending on how much energy is absorbed by that molecule, it might emit other wavelengths. It might let some heat out for some of the energy, and that is going to go in all directions. Some of it goes back out into space and it's gone, which is good, right? We have energy coming in and energy going out. But some of it is going to be continuing to sort of bounce around in the atmosphere back down to Earth, to other greenhouse gas molecules, etc. Okay? And this, of course, has always been happening on Earth, right? And keeps us at a nice habitable temperature. But as we increase the concentration of greenhouse gases, more infrared radiation being emitted by the Earth is hitting greenhouse gas molecules and being bounced around for a little bit longer. So more energy is staying near the Earth, more heat is staying near the Earth for a longer period of time before it gets bounced into space. So it just makes us a little bit warmer all the time. So Jerry, as far as the difference between infrared light and heat, so first of all, we say infrared radiation, but that is a form of light. It's kind of a wavelength on the light spectrum that we can't see. You need to know it enough to explain the greenhouse effect, okay? So there is energy in our atmosphere that is in both forms, okay? But the reason that infrared radiation is important is because the Earth is emitting a lot of infrared radiation. From the energy that it got originally from the solar radiation. And the other reason that infrared radiation is important is because that's the wavelength that's picked up by these greenhouse gas molecules, right? Heat is not especially picked up by greenhouse gas molecules any more than other molecules. It just sort of dissipates out into space. But the infrared radiation is. So that's the connection, is to realize that the greenhouse gas molecules are able to absorb this particular infrared radiation that results when the Earth is warm and puts out infrared radiation, okay? And so it's able to sort of re-emit it back down towards Earth. Okay, Matthew has a question about the short-term and long-term effects of climate change. I'm not sure quite what you mean by that question. There are going to be many, many, many effects. Some of them will be noticeable to us sooner than other ones. Many of them are happening gradually. Some will happen more suddenly. So I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you can refine that question, I can try to answer it better. Okay, so Marwa is asking about the peer review for climate change. So it is standard in science, the way that science works is that for legitimate science to be considered legitimate, it is published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Okay, which means, of course, that other scientists in the field evaluate the paper before it's published to make sure that it's at least reasonable. Maybe not completely perfect or accurate or the final answer on anything, but it's reasonable. They have evidence that is real evidence, right, that people in the field would accept, and their statistics are good and their conclusions are reasonable based on the evidence that they have. Whether or not that again turns out to be the absolute answer, okay? That exists throughout science and in the social sciences and most academic fields. Okay, so that's sort of regular peer review. That's already pretty good, right? It's mostly a self-correcting system, not perfect, but over time, very much self-correcting. Because of the importance and urgency of climate science, and because of the pushback to some extent to that science, the United Nations formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a body of scientists, thousands of scientists from all around the world, to do an extra level of review, right? To go through all the climate science that's published, which is a lot, right? And to sort of put it together and come up with the best summaries and descriptions and predictions of what's going on. And they publish reports that basically governments and organizations and businesses can use to try to deal with the issue of climate change. And so that is something that doesn't exist in any other field of science in that way, right? This sort of international body that continues to check the work and make sure that it is the best science that we can possibly come up with. Okay, Hayden's asking about the attacks on climate science. There are a number of reasons for that. Sometimes it's personal gain. Some organizations make money off of businesses that emit greenhouse gases, and so they have a personal reason to attack that. But in many cases, it's more what we call ideological. It's more what people believe about how the world should be. And so people who have a belief that there should be less government regulation, more of a free market system, often are, I don't know if I say often, but are sometimes opposed to the solutions for climate change, because many of those would involve a great deal of regulation and change, right? And maybe not always the free market, maybe saying that you can't sell things that are inefficient, right? Or limiting the amount of carbon dioxide that could be emitted. So if you are a strict believer in the free market, then you would not like that as a solution, right? And so the idea is that people who don't like the solution often attack the problem, right? If I don't like some solution, if I don't like, you telling me that I need to get more sleep, I might just say you're wrong because I don't want to take time to get more sleep, right? So even though you might actually be right, I probably do need to get more sleep, by attacking the credibility of the scientists, right? I might be able to change people's mind. Okay, so that's kind of the basic idea. Joseph says monetary benefit, and yes, sometimes it's monetary benefit. I think it's Amrita, hello, is asking, how does the geological and biological cycle relate to climate change? Those are just other terms for what I usually call the fast and the slow, just to kind of make it more clear to us. Geological is slow, it means rocks, right? But it could also refer to things like fossil fuels. Biological cycle is typically fast because the carbon is pretty quickly moving through living things and the atmosphere, okay? I prefer fast and slow, actually, because some biological things are slow, as I went over in class. Okay, hold on, I got off track on the questions again, so. Okay, so there's a number of questions that are relating to, ozone and ultraviolet light. Um, I don't want to dive too deep in that because I found when I talk too much about ozone, people get it all confused with climate change. So I don't actually teach about it much anymore. Okay, I'm going to give you kind of a very short capsule version. Um, Due to some chemicals that we mostly don't use anymore, called CFCs, humans created a whole separate global problem a number of years ago called the hole in the ozone layer. That's a problem because the ozone is protecting us from some damaging ultraviolet light. Okay? We have gone a long way as a world towards solving that problem. Countries in the world got together and agreed not to use these particular chemicals anymore. Okay? And in some ways, this is a very, very positive thing because it's an example where the world actually got together, agreed to make the necessary changes, and did it. And even though it's going to take a while, the hole in the ozone layer is actually closing, and that problem is getting better. Okay, so that's awesome, right? Now, of course, climate change is much more difficult because this was a very narrow range of chemicals that we had to stop using. It wasn't all fossil fuels that we're used to burning for our energy. So the problem that we're facing now is much more difficult, but the process of getting together to solve that problem in some ways should be the same, right? In terms of all the countries sort of making agreements and sticking to them in order to solve what is really a global problem. We can't separate the atmosphere into countries, right? We all share the same atmosphere. Thanks, Atul. I really appreciate your advice about studying for the information, I would say, to learn, and the good score will follow. It's also a lot less stressful, right? So, yeah, good advice. Delar is asking about energy flow relating to homeostasis and metabolism. So first thing I'm going to tell you to refer back to the Stability and Change Language Guide. There's a really nice explanation of that there. But my point was that homeostasis and metabolism are both characteristics of life. Okay, what that means is that every living thing maintains some kind of homeostasis of some conditions. Every living thing has metabolism, meaning that they perform chemical reactions and move molecules and energy around, right? Those are just part of what it means to be alive. Sometimes they connect to each other, okay? Because sometimes, in order to maintain homeostasis, it requires an input of energy, okay? How do we have energy available? Because we do metabolic reactions like cellular respiration, which provides energy in the form of ATP that we can use to do things like shiver to maintain homeostasis. But not every chemical reaction has anything to do with homeostasis, and certainly not every kind of maintaining homeostasis has to do with metabolism. Okay, a lot of homeostasis is actually maintained through hormones. You'll learn that later in the year, and that's not really directly a metabolic thing. Okay, let's see. Um, Kevin, I'm going to rephrase something that you said here. You said energy cycles because it starts with producers and goes up to trophic levels, and then the decomposers come and take the energy. We do not say that energy cycles, okay? We say that energy flows and matter cycles. Okay, the difference is that cycles means that it's going around the planet. No new is coming in and none is going out, that we're just cycling the same old thing, like carbon. Okay, atoms, physical atoms on this planet are cycling around, right? Carbon can go from the atmosphere to living things, back out into the atmosphere, into a rock, whatever, okay? But it's not coming onto Earth and it's not leaving Earth. It's cycling around, recycling, okay? Energy is not like that. We constantly have a flow of new energy, solar radiation, right? And an almost equal amount of energy is constantly leaving this planet as heat. So energy in, energy out, energy flows. Okay, if we ever turned the sun off and stopped having energy on Earth, life would gradually cease to exist. Okay, because all the energy on Earth would leave as heat and we would not have any for life. Okay, so energy flows, matter cycles. Yeah, Sarah was talking about something about the cows releasing methane. Yes, and cows release a lot of methane, and um, I'll briefly say the reason for that is because there's a lot of bacteria in their stomachs. I believe they have more than one stomach that are digesting things without oxygen. And remember that when you do respiration with oxygen, you release carbon dioxide. In many cases, when you do a different kind of respiration without oxygen, and we can't do this, bacteria can, they release methane instead. So cows end up essentially burping out a lot of methane all the time from their stomachs. Okay, so and when their manure is kind of all sitting around, which there's a lot of manure from cows, um, sometimes methane comes out of that for the same reason if you have these kinds of bacteria. So the raising of cows ends up contributing a lot of methane to the environment, as well as all the carbon and the energy that comes out of growing all the corn and all the other food for the cows. It's very much of a big contributor to the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, I'll go back briefly. Avanish was asking about the homeostasis and metabolism and how that relates to equilibrium. Um, so equilibrium is a dynamic sort of balance, right? Dynamic because it doesn't mean things are just staying the same, but say, for example, if an equal, if carbon dioxide were diffusing into the ocean at an equal rate that it were diffusing out, we would call that equilibrium. It doesn't mean nothing's happening, but the two forces are sort of in balance, okay? We are not in equilibrium with our environment, okay? Maintaining homeostasis is sort of the opposite of equilibrium with your environment, okay? I am keeping my body quite a bit warmer now than the room I am in, a lot warmer, right? 20 or 30 degrees warmer. So I'm not in equilibrium. I'm doing a lot of work and using a lot of energy from my food to keep myself a lot warmer, out of equilibrium with my environment, right? And I want to keep myself in the fairly narrow range, and it often does take energy to do that. If and that's a characteristic of life. If I were no longer alive doing that, guess what? Pretty quickly, my body would cool to the temperature of this room, and I'd be in equilibrium, right? Because I wouldn't be alive anymore. I thought I had enough battery, and I can see I'm getting a low battery announcement, so I'm willing to keep going a little bit, but I need to take a little sort of a 30-second break to grab my charger. Okay, so get yourself a little drink of water, and I'll be right back. Okay. Okay, I'm back. So I'm going to go back to the list here and sort of get my bearings and see where I am. Okay, so George is asking about direct effects of climate change. Okay, so George, I'm going to reword your question here because climate change is sort of the final effect. Okay, because those are all the effects of the physical changes happening on Earth are called climate change. Okay, so if you're going to talk about cause and effect, the initial cause is this increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, that has effects, right? So remember your flow chart and keep coming back to those ideas of how everything's connected. Also, don't forget that in the climate and the carbon cycle debrief, there is a list of different effects as well. It's a little bit different than your flow chart, but a similar idea. Okay, so just briefly, carbon dioxide at the top, or greenhouse gases in general, are increasing the greenhouse effect, right? Which is causing global warming, and the warmer temperatures cause all kinds of different effects. Independently, not all the greenhouse gases, but carbon dioxide is diffusing into the ocean at a faster rate, which is increasing ocean acidification, which also has a number of effects. Okay? So when I use a term like physical effects, I mean physical things happening. Could be changes in temperature or pH. Those are certainly driving a lot of things, right? And those conditions are going to cause many secondary, third level, fourth level effects on Earth. Okay, Delara, you have a question about what factors determine the change in a population. Not quite sure what you mean by that, because populations can change in many ways. So I would say if I was going to summarize some of the main ideas around that, that populations tend to fluctuate. Why? Because organisms keep reproducing, and the more they reproduce, the more limiting factors are going to kick in, right? Because predators will come and eat them, they're going to run out of resources, disease will spread, right? And populations will tend to go down. And then as there are fewer organisms, they start to have more resources again, right? Predators die off, etc. And organisms reproduce and population starts to rise. Okay, so those are some of the things that would make a population change. So if you have a more specific question, let me know. I think I saw a thing about direct effects as being thermal expansion and global warming. Yeah, go back to my previous explanation. Okay, thermal expansion is an effect of global warming. Okay, because it's warmer, oceans are expanding. Jerry's asking, do we need to know biomagnification? I no longer teach biomagnification, not because it's not important, just trying to cut back. Okay, it is in short, what it means is that if there's a toxin in the environment, because of the way that biological pyramids work, that if it say it is in producers, right, and then a little consumer eats it, and then say it's a little fish, right, and the little fish gets some toxin, some pollution, and then the bigger fish eats a lot of little fish. So the bigger fish tends to have a higher concentration of the toxin, and the bigger fish, right? So what that means is that organisms at the top of the food chain tend to have higher levels of certain kinds of pollutants. Okay, it's the reason that we worry about things like tuna having more mercury. It's not something I actively teach anymore, but it is another threat to top predators, and it is actually related because part of this mercury comes from burning fossil fuels. So related, but I'm not teaching that in my course this year. So Matthew's asking if it's possible for climate change to cause global warming instead of vice versa. No, that's not the way that it works. Okay, again, in common usage, people tend to use these terms interchangeably, but it's the warming that's causing the change. That's technically what those terms mean. Ria's asking about the effects of climate on biodiversity. There's going to be many, right? So climate change, because it changes conditions, that's going to affect biodiversity. And it could be anything from, temperature and pH changing to things like a season, spring and summer start differently. It could be the availability of water, right? So anytime that climate change is changing conditions, that's not just hard for us, that's hard for all the other living things. And if it's hard enough, and if the organisms cannot adapt or cannot migrate someplace different, they might go extinct, right? So that's why climate change is a major threat to biodiversity, because it's going to change, and already is changing, so many habitats at a pretty rapid rate. Thanks, Atul. Atul is just having great advice tonight. He's pointing out that you need to know the things that are on the unit guide. So yeah, it's kind of a clue, for example, that biomagnification is not on my unit guide, right? person I don't know is asking about energy processing. I've never heard that term before, so I'm not sure what you mean. If you can rephrase that or explain that question, I can try to address it, but that's not a standard term. Maggie's asking about scientific consensus and portfolio standard. Those are two entirely different things. So scientific consensus means that the vast majority, like 99% of scientists, agree that climate change is happening and that it is a result of human activity. That's an anthropogenic, okay, a result of what humans are doing, not natural variation. Okay, and that is considered scientific consensus. It does not have to be every last person. Portfolio standards. So they're called renewable portfolio standards or renewable energy standards, and those are a type of regulation that usually a city would make. Sometimes a state like California, could be the whole country, but we don't do that right now. But for example, the state of California has a renewable portfolio standard saying that we need to have a certain percent of our energy coming from renewable sources within certain periods of time. Okay, a portfolio is when you have like a collection of things together. So the idea is that, our energy is kind of like our portfolio. We can have some solar, some natural gas, some nuclear, and that's our whole portfolio of energy sources. Okay, so that's what that term refers to. Let's see here. Okay, that was Pinky. Hello, Pinky. Okay, Mar was asking, do we need to know the green paper? Well, I've given you several green papers, so I can't really help you with that question right now. Not sure what you're talking about. You might be talking about the green sheet. You should know a few things about the major philosophy of this class. I'll leave it at that. Let's see. I'm sure they organize some peer review for bigger documents, but not for every single document. Okay, I'm not sure I understand that comment. There's a comment saying that there's peer review for some documents, but not for every single one. Peer review does apply to any paper that's in a scientific journal, but again, not to information or documents that are not in a scientific journal. Maggie's asking what subsidies are. So subsidies came up when we talked about ways to address climate change. And the idea is a subsidy is when the government provides money to sort of help some business along. Sometimes the money goes directly to the business. Sometimes it goes to the consumers like us. For example, you might get a subsidy from the state of California if you buy an electric car. Okay? But the problem is that a lot of subsidies right now, a tremendous amount, an enormous amount of money, is still being given to fossil fuel producing companies. And that, of course, allows their products to be cheaper, which encourages people to keep using fossil fuels, right? So it has been suggested that by reducing those subsidies, yes, those products would become more expensive, but then perhaps people would use them less. Okay, and I think, Sophia, your question about the 5 pathways carbon could take, that's from the carbon cycle review. Rather than me trying to sort of figure that off the top of my head, there is a key posted in the locker, so please check that. Okay, Leo's asking about trend in a graph. So this has actually come up a few times in the class, but the sort of classic one is the Keeling curve, right? So I'll use my fingers. If you remember, the Keeling curve kind of goes like this, right? So that even though the actual measurements go up and down with the seasons of the year, okay, there's an overall trend. The line is gradually moving upwards, meaning that over time, at any season of the year, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing. Okay, so the general trend, the general direction is up, even though the individual measurements fluctuate. Excuse me. Okay, there's some questions about biotic and abiotic. So a tool's asking, how are the shells in the ocean biotic? Because they're organic material made by a living thing. Okay, and that's just how we define it's kind of part of the biosphere, right? It got made by the shell. I mean, I'm sorry, by the sea organism, right? It made a calcium carbonate shell, so it contains carbon. It's organic matter, right? And so that is considered biotic. And ultimately, of course, humans decided these categories. I mean, eventually that carbon could become part of a rock that we would not consider biotic, but the shell itself is sort of immediately from the organism, and so we do still consider that biotic. Okay, another example would be my hair. It's protein, it's not alive, but it's still considered biotic. Same with dead things on the ground or waste coming out of something, right? It's all biotic. Okay, didn't even need to say that. You guys all give a great answer. That's cool, you're not dumb. Don't say mean things to yourself. Be kind to yourself. It's a good habit. So Marwa was asking about reclaiming water. Okay, so there's a sort of big idea of recycling water. Okay, that's the sort of one of the big ideas in sustainable water. We can use less, we can recycle what we have, right? Um, but we can recycle it on different scales. Okay, there's different kinds of recycling. I can recycle in my house by, you know, putting a bucket under the shower while it's heating up and using that water to water my plants. That's considered gray water, even though that water is actually perfectly clean, right? But we use the term gray water because, say, it was water that came out of your washing machine, right? It's pretty clean. Like, it might have some dirt, it might have some soap, right? But those things aren't generally toxic. And if I poured that water on my plants, it would probably be just fine. Okay, so that's considered gray water recycling, meaning water in your house that's a little bit dirty, but not sewage in the sense of being like toilet water. Okay, and we could reuse it. When we use the term reclaimed water, we're usually meaning on a much, much bigger scale. So a gazillion gallons of water at the wastewater treatment plant that's been treated, it's not toxic anymore, it's pretty clean, and we can recycle that in a number of ways. Most commonly, we use it to water landscaping on a large scale, like city gardens or a golf course or something like that. Um, there are places starting to experiment with cleaning it to an even higher standard and testing it, and then actually reusing that as drinking water. That's not common yet. It's hard to kind of get people to be okay with that idea. But we certainly could be reusing it for lots of other purposes that we use a lot of water for, like irrigation or watering landscaping. Yeah, Ria's talking about how warmer water holds less carbon dioxide, which is true. And you can think of like a soda warming up and how the bubbles go out, right? Um, and that is part of it. It's not something I talked about a lot, but you can see it's just another variable. All this stuff is really complex because temperature, pH, different gases, different molecules all react with each other. And that's why you need these very complex climate models. Okay, I think there was a question about how global warming affects ocean acidification. Not at all. Okay, one does not lead to the other. They are both results, effects of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, and I am skipping a few questions that I explained earlier in the live stream. So either another student might answer it, or you could check out the earlier part of the live stream later on. Okay, so Diti, I did some description of the IPCC earlier, so I'm going to skip that one for now. Minjay is asking about acid rain. Again, that's another thing we haven't covered in this class. It's a thing. It's related because a lot of the pollution that comes out of, like, for example, a coal power plant, there's a lot of nasty chemicals in that. And sometimes that hurts people directly in terms of air pollution. Sometimes when it rains, the water passes through these chemicals, like there's sulfur compounds, and that can become sulfuric acid or other kinds of acid, and then that harms um, certain kinds of life. It's been a problem for certain kinds of trees, more on the East Coast where they burn more coal. And so for a while, this problem of acid rain was talked about a lot. It's still something of a problem, although I don't hear about it as much as I used to, so I'm not sure. It tends to be a little bit more of an East Coast problem, so I don't know as much about that. It's not directly related to climate change, but it's more of a pollution issue. Um, So Adrian's asking about effects of changes in the ocean. We mostly connected that to, organisms in the sea not doing so well, right? And some of those are things that make shells. Some of them just aren't able to adapt very well to those changing conditions. Sahib is asking what's an experimental control. So an experimental control is something that you have within an experiment um, that does not contain the variable you're testing, okay, which is called the independent variable. So if you think about the experiment with our hands in the water, we wanted to know if our hands, whether they were still or moving, were heating up the water. The only way to know that for sure is to have some water without a hand, right? Because how do we know it wasn't just the room heating up the water and not our hands? The only way to know that is to test the water without any hands, okay? And so that's called an experimental control. Sometimes it's called a control group as opposed to an experimental group where you're actually testing the thing like the hands, okay? So Kush is asking, wouldn't it be smarter to put windmills closer to the ocean as there are more winds in the area? We use both kinds. So you'll hear terms like onshore wind and offshore wind. It's really just wherever the wind patterns happen to be. And you're right, there are often some pretty strong winds right near the coast. But it depends on a lot of factors. It depends what's under the water in that area and whether the people living near the coast are going to accept having those windmills there, right? So or wind turbines, I should say. There's a ton of factors that go into where we put the wind turbines. Having good wind is one of those factors, but there's a bunch of other factors, and everybody has to kind of agree and have the money and all that to put the wind turbine in. So, but we do have wind turbines on land and in the ocean, and I think hopefully we'll have more in both places. Sharon is asking about data analysis and data interpretation. I'm just pausing because I'm trying to think if I remember right now. God, at the moment, I feel like I'm getting those two mixed up. One of them has to do with, and you're going to see this interestingly in about a week. When we start our new unit, we're going to do an exercise about this. But one of them is sort of seeing what's actually happening with the data, like it's trending up, right? And then the other one is saying what that means. Okay, the fact that it's trending up means there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time, or higher concentration, right? So it has to do with sort of what you see in the graph, the actual data itself, and the other is having to do with sort of what it means in your particular context. Okay, we'll talk about that more next week. Okay, Heike, I already talked about California, so I don't want to delve into that too much. I mentioned sea level rise, wildfires, and water supply. George is asking if nuclear fission is renewable. Technically not. There's only so much uranium on Earth, but I don't think that's really the limiting factor. There's a lot of other problems with nuclear. There's some good things about it too. I'd say not. But sometimes we treat it like it is because it doesn't have carbon emissions. So you'll sometimes see it listed under renewable energy sources. I think what they really mean is no carbon emissions. But my understanding is also that there's probably plenty of uranium on Earth for what we use. I'm not an expert on that. Okay, yeah, Rohin's been giving a good explanation of fast and slow cycle. Okay, so Ryan, when you talk about human intervention, changing these fast and slow cycles, the main thing, of course, is burning fossil fuels. Taking it from the fossil fuels, which are part of the slow/geological cycle, putting it into the atmosphere where it circulates in the faster biological cycle. Okay, again, I don't love that term because atmosphere isn't strictly biological and etc. Deforestation, same thing, right? Slow, big forest, fast in the atmosphere. So Rohin's asking how these small changes in temperature change the climate so dramatically. It has to do with the fact that climate is what we call a chaotic system. That sometimes one little change can end up having these big effects, right? Because of the way that climate works. You change the evaporation of water a little bit, and now you've got different amounts of water vapor in many parts, of the atmosphere. That has effects. Those effects have effects. So that tiny thing ends up kind of cascading into all these other kinds of effects, which can be somewhat unpredictable. So, and again, without getting any more technical about climate than I probably can, it's a chaotic system and it can have very dramatic effects. In terms of hurricanes, my understanding, and again, I'm probably not giving the best technical explanation of this, is that when the storm is actually moving over the water, that if the water is warmer, it does actually pick up some of that energy and becomes a stronger storm in that way. And increased precipitation is going to make that worse because part of what does damage to us in a hurricane is all the rain that's coming down, right? Massive amounts of rain. And then part of what does the damage is the actual movement of the storm, like the wind and the destructive power of that, along with the storm surges that come on land as a hurricane sort of brings all that force onto land. Okay, Jen, I just not too long ago, a few minutes ago, I answered the question about trend and variation. You can have variation or fluctuation in data, but it could generally trend in a certain direction. Again, Matthew, I also did answer the question about biodiversity. Many effects of changes happening on Earth in lots of conditions. I love Joseph's answer. Badly, yeah, pretty much. Although I will briefly mention it doesn't affect all things equally, right? Some organisms are able to tolerate a wider range, and it's not going to affect them as much. Okay, we're going to talk about this a lot in evolution. Okay, some organisms are able to tolerate change better than others. And those organisms are more likely to survive. Organisms that are more specialized and have a more narrow range of conditions that they can live in, they're going to suffer first, right? They're the ones most likely to go extinct. So, Ayan, your question is too broad. It says, can you go over the negative and positive feedback mechanisms that affect climate change? There are many. Okay, if you have a specific one that you want me to review, I can try to do that briefly. But I mean, there's tons of them built into these climate models, right? The key thing to remember is if it's making the problem more and more and more, then that's positive feedback. If it's a kind of feedback loop that actually is sort of helping us, right? Like carbon dioxide does help plants grow a bit faster, and then they can absorb more carbon dioxide. That's kind of helping us a little bit. The concern is really that the positive feedback loops are likely to outweigh the negative feedback loops, right? Because of this more and more aspect of them. So Moog, you're asking how climate change and temperature rise relate. So temperature rise is what we call global warming in terms of the average global temperature. So remember, global warming is causing the effects of climate change. Okay, so Mar was asking about the term limiting factors. So limiting factor is anything that limits what you're talking about. So in the case of population, a limiting factor is anything that stops a population from growing. Okay, and in fact, in many cases, starts to bring it down. Okay, so eventually, if I have a growing population, they're going to run out of certain resources. Those resources now become a limiting factor to that population. Okay, so time is a limiting factor, right? You guys might have more and more questions, but eventually, pretty soon in fact, we're going to run out of time. So time will be the limiting factor in this review. Probably not your questions, right? If you ran out of questions, then no more questions might be the limiting factor, but it's probably going to be time. Question about percolation ponds. Okay, good, that hasn't come up yet. So the main function of percolation ponds is to recharge aquifers, and we use recharge, but they do sometimes serve other functions. So we talked about this idea of letting stormwater runoff go into a percolation pond. And then the percolation pond is actually helping us to deal with water pollution, because instead of that pollution going down a storm drain, going straight to some body of water without getting filtered and therefore adding to water pollution. And stormwater runoff is a major source of water pollution. If we run it to a percolation pond, then as it seeps into the ground, that pollution is sort of naturally filtered and cleaned by the rocks and by the bacteria. And so it helps us to deal with some of that stormwater runoff pollution. And so in that case, the percolation pond is offering us multiple services. But the reason that they're put in is typically to help recharge aquifers. Okay, Raga's asking, does global warming accelerate the effect of greenhouse gases? So the greenhouse gases are increasing in concentration. That enhances the greenhouse effect, which is causing global warming. Okay, so it's more the other way around than what you wrote. Yeah, Rohin's clarifying as well. So Vidusha, you wrote if the birth rate goes down, it could limit the population. That's not really the way we use that term. If the birth rate goes down, the population would go down. But that's not what's limiting it. What's limiting it is what's stopping it from going up. Okay, which is just a slightly different meaning. Liana's asking about immigration versus emigration. So remember that immigration, like the letter I, organisms coming into a population, right? Emigration, I think of exit, organizations, organisms going out, right? And those have to do with population size, okay? Immigration, of course, would make a population increase. Emigration would make a population decrease. Mo's asking about sedimentary rock. You don't need to know a ton about that. It's just part of the carbon cycle, right? So I would say if you sort of even somewhat understood the idea that carbon in the ocean in the form of shells and things sinks to the bottom, becomes sedimentary rock, and then gets stuck for a gazillion million years and is not an issue for us anymore. Okay, but that rock does contain a lot of carbon. Oh, interesting. So Adrian's asking if aquifers affect the height that a place is above sea level. I think yes. Just I hadn't really thought of it in that way, but if an aquifer is depleted, remember that the land sinks, right? So it could sink below sea level, and this actually is a problem in a place like New Orleans. The land is subsiding, which means it's sinking. So it's not so much that New Orleans floods because of sea level rise, although that will become more and more of a problem. It's because the land is actually sinking. And that, I don't know if that's specifically due to aquifers. I can't remember at the moment why their land is subsiding. But yes, there is a connection there in terms of where the land is and whether it's sinking or not. um, Thank you, Liana, for your comment about the giraffe. So just FYI, it's new. I'm very excited. My mom was here the other night and wanted to take me shopping, as my mom likes to do. And so my giraffe is an early Christmas gift, and I'm very happy with my giraffe. I saw it and I liked it instantly, and it's very cool. I haven't decided about the name yet. Maybe George, but I might try to come up with something more original. So thank you. I like my giraffe. Maybe I'll give you a close-up later. Let's see. And yeah, just a heads up, we are going to, we'll probably cut this off pretty soon because I'm tired and we all need to go to sleep. So maybe just a few more minutes. I'll aim for closing down around 9:30. So I'm just going to look for some sort of new questions here. Priya, characteristics of life. I'm not going to sit here and run off a list. Check your textbook. I'm not going to ask you to list them. I'm going to be honest, right? You should know what they mean. I spent time in class talking specifically about, and on this live stream, talking about homeostasis and metabolism because they're the hardest to understand, right? But yes, you should have a general sense, and you can check your textbook for the easier ones. Okay, here's a question about carrying capacity. Haven't had much of that, so let me address that quickly. So Carrying capacity, you want to associate that with the environment, right? With the resources available in the environment. A given environment has a certain amount of resources available for some kind of organism, right? If it's a mice that eats seeds in the meadow, then the meadow has only so many plants and so many seeds that can support a certain number of mice, okay? Sustainably, right? Because there's going to be a time of year where there aren't so many seeds, right? And maybe there's only a certain number of mice that can survive all year, even if they overshoot periodically because all of a sudden there's a lot of seeds available and the mice reproduce a lot. But as they eat up the sort of surplus, the mice population is going to go down and return to the sort of sustainable number of mice. Okay? So the population will fluctuate in this way. Reproduction, limiting factors. Okay? Carrying capacity refers to the environment. So if there is a drought and not so many plants can live in this meadow, the carrying capacity for mice actually goes down because there aren't as many resources available in the environment. So we would say that the carrying capacity has gone down. Okay? Maybe there's a good year and lots of plants grow and the carrying capacity increases. Okay? Because the environment can support more mice. Something like that. Okay? So changes to the environment can change the carrying capacity for a given organism. Divya is asking about point source versus non-point source pollution. So it means where it comes from. So the word source, right? Point source, think of like a point, right? So the idea of point source is we can say the pollution is coming from there. Like, ooh, there's this evil factory and they're dumping waste into the water behind the factory. That's a point source. That's easier to deal with because you know what? We can hopefully find out about it. We can shut down the factory and find them and stop them from polluting the water. Okay? Unfortunately, much of our problem with pollution is non-point source. Okay? Meaning that a lot of water pollution comes from stormwater runoff. It's happening every time it rains because all of us drive our cars and leave things on the road, et cetera, right? So that pollution is coming from many, many points. And therefore, in some ways, it's more difficult to solve. And this is true of air pollution as well, right? Many cars, for example, are contributing to air pollution, and that is harder to solve. Okay? If you had a particular power plant, like a coal-fired power plant, that was contributing to air pollution, that would be a point source, and we could potentially do something about that. We can do things about non-point source pollution. It's just harder. We have to educate people and change systems and things like that. Yeah, thanks, Joseph, for providing some stuff about the calcium carbonate and such in the ocean. I'm not going to, I'll just tell you, I'm not going to ask you about those specific chemical reactions, but I'd expect you to get the big picture that carbon dioxide in water makes this acid, and that makes it harder for organisms to form their shells. Honestly, I'm not going to go deeper than that. I used to, but it's just something I've kind of let go of. David, metabolism and homeostasis. I don't know. I don't know exactly when I went over it. I would say it was like in the first half sometime. I wish there was a way. I think there's a way to go through and tag different parts of the transcript about when things were covered. If somebody knows about that, let me know. It'd be a great thing to do, but only if I don't have to do it. Adrian's asking about biodiversity and resilience. Okay. So this kind of gets back to the mitigation and adaptation point. So I said that oftentimes, if we protect nature, it provides many benefits, both mitigation and adaptation in many cases. So resilience is sort of related to adaptation, but has a slightly different meaning, right? Adaptation could be, moving people away from the coast or building a seawall, right? Resilience is sort of it implies being able to bounce back from serious things that happen. So it might be more like things we do to be able to bounce back after a storm faster, right? Dr. Schrag gave the example of like having pumps in the subway that can pump the water out quickly after a storm. So it's this recovering. So the word resilience is sort of this ability to recover. So if we know that really harsh things are going to happen suddenly in the future, right? If we can be already all set up to recover quickly, right, then that is having more resilience. Okay, adaptation doesn't have that sense of like recovering instantly. It might, or not instantly, just recovering in general. It could be just making decisions like moving farther away from the coast, which is more of adaptation. Okay, again, I'm just kind of flipping through and looking for some new topics here. Okay, MJ, if that's Mary Jane, I don't know. No, we did not do biomagnification and bioaccumulation in my class. I did give a brief description earlier in this live stream. I hope my computer's not overheating. I do hear the fan on though, you're right. See, that's interesting because people were complaining about the audio earlier, but if you can hear that, the audio must be pretty good. Yeah, Joseph, your description of metabolism, obtain and use materials and energy. That's true, but I'm going to tell you that's not a description that most makes sense to most people, right? It's easier to think about that in terms of chemical reactions, but it means the same thing, right? If you think about photosynthesis, that's obtaining materials and energy, right? You're taking carbon atoms from the air and energy from the sun and putting it in glucose. That's obtaining and using materials and energy, right? So I think it's more helpful to us to think of it in terms of chemical reactions, which do move atoms and molecules around in different forms and do transfer energy around. Okay, so it means the same thing. Okay, okay, whew. I think I'm going to start to wrap it up. So, yeah, I really appreciate all you guys tuning in. I hope this is helpful, and I wish you all the best on the exam tomorrow. Get a good night's sleep. Do make sure you do the unit feedback if you haven't done that yet. It's due at 10 p.m. tonight. But otherwise, relax. You've worked hard. You know, do your best. It's going to be fine. Okay, so I'm excited to see what you guys know. I can already tell by your responses online you've learned a lot, so you should be really proud of yourself for all the work you've put in. I'll tell you what, I'll real quickly walk over here and do a giraffe close-up. He's very cute because he has different colored spots. It's a little dim over here, but hopefully you can see. I do have another kitty, by the way. Usually she visits as well, but for some reason she wasn't participating today. So maybe she'll come visit us in the next live stream. Okay, I have no idea if you can see the giraffe or not because there's kind of this serious lag time on my video. Anyway, that was your giraffe viewing for the evening. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Hope you guys, oh wow, it looks like you mostly got giraffe neck. Okay, but he does have a cute neck. Okay, that's it for now, and have a great evening for the rest of the time. Thanks, Joseph. You're very welcome. Enjoy your evening, and I'll see all of you tomorrow. Take care.